This is Death and the Girl. At first glance, it is perhaps one of the most haunting meditations on mortality ever committed to canvas by Frans van Kuyck. Imagine, for a moment, that you are walking through the Belgian countryside on a late summer evening in the late 19th century. The air is cooling, the sky is beginning to bruise with deep violets and oranges, and the dust of the road feels warm beneath your feet. It is a scene of utter tranquility. You see a young girl ahead of you. She is dressed in the simple, honest clothes of a rural laborer, perhaps a farmer's daughter, wearing a bright yellow pinafore and a clean white bonnet. She has stopped to gather flowers, vibrant golden blooms that she holds in a thick bouquet against her chest. She looks down at them with a quiet, focused kind of joy, the sort of peace that only belongs to the very young or the very innocent. But as you look closer, the tranquility of the scene begins to curdle. Walking right beside her, so close their shadows almost mingle on the dirt path, is a towering, skeletal figure draped in a tattered brown shroud. The contrast is absolute, and the silence between them is deafening. To understand how a painting can be this gentle and this terrifying at the same time, we have to look at the man who held the brush. Frans van Kuyck was not a starving artist living in a garret dreaming of ghosts. He was a pillar of Antwerp society. He was a teacher, the deputy director of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, and a high-ranking city official. This was a man who spent his daylight hours building the world. He oversaw the restoration of medieval guild halls, the creation of public parks, and even the establishment of Mother's Day in Belgium. He was an architect of permanence, a man dedicated to civic order and the preservation of history. Yet, when he stepped away from his official duties and into his studio, he painted this. It reveals a fascinating psychological split. The public Van Kuyck was building monuments to last for centuries, but the private Van Kuyck was acutely aware that the setting sun waits for every one of us, regardless of how many buildings we restore or how many laws we pass. This tension is baked into the very way the painting is constructed. Van Kuyck was a student of the en plein air tradition, which meant he believed in painting in the open air, capturing the world exactly as it looked under the changing light of the sun. Usually, this technique is used to create bright, cheerful landscapes. But here, Van Kuyck uses that hyperrealism to ground a supernatural nightmare. The grass in the foreground is meticulously rendered. You can see the individual white and yellow wildflowers dotting the turf. The ruts in the dirt path look like you could trip over them. By making the environment so tangible and real, he makes the skeleton feel real too. This isn't a dream or a hallucination. In Van Kuyck's world, death is as much a part of the landscape as the clouds or the dirt. It is a biological fact, a silent architecture that walks among us. If we look at the girl, we see the embodiment of a beautiful, temporary ignorance. She represents humanity in its most uncorrupted state. She is looking down, focused entirely on her flowers, physically and psychologically turned away from the massive entity to her left. This is the psychological shield of youth. When we are young, death is a rumor, something that happens to other people in other places. Her innocence allows her to exist in a state of grace, picking flowers while the reaper looms over her shoulder. But for us, the viewers, the experience is different. We are placed in a position of preemptive mourning. We see the trajectory she cannot see. We know that the path they are on only goes in one direction, and that eventually the bouquet will wilt, and she will have to look up. The flowers themselves are a masterpiece of symbolic coding. In the 19th century, people spoke the language of flowers, where every bloom had a specific meaning. Yellow flowers were deeply dualistic. On one hand, they symbolized the sun, energy, and the dawn of life. They matched the girl's dress, creating a visual halo of vitality around her. But yellow also had a darker side in the Victorian imagination. It could hint at betrayal, or the yellowing of age and decay. More importantly, the moment a flower is picked, it is technically already dead. It is severed from its life source, displaying a final, desperate burst of beauty before it turns to brown dust. By filling the girl's hands with these blooms, Van Kuyck is telling us that her own life is in its cut flower phase. She is at the height of her radiance, which means the rot is only moments away. As our eyes move from the girl to her companion, we encounter the most revolutionary part of this artwork. This is not the Grim Reaper of the Middle Ages. He isn't a mocking demon. In fact, if you look at the way his head is bowed, he almost looks sorrowful. He seems to be leaning toward the girl, not to strike her, but perhaps to listen to her breathe. His scythe, the traditional tool of the harvest, isn't held high in a threatening gesture. Instead, the blade points harmlessly toward the ground, dragging near his feet like a heavy piece of luggage. It's as if he is a laborer at the end of a very long shift, carrying his tools home because he has to, not because he wants to. But the real masterstroke, the detail that elevates this painting into a league of its own, is what the skeleton is holding in his other hand. He is using walking sticks. He is leaning on crutches. Think about how strange that is. A skeleton has no muscles to tire, no lungs to burn, and no nerves to feel pain. An immortal force of nature should not need a physical support, and yet, Van Kuyck's death is clearly struggling to walk. This is a depiction of what scholars call der müde Tod, the weary death. This is an entity that has been walking the earth since the first cell divided and died. He has escorted billions of souls into the dark, and he is absolutely, fundamentally exhausted. By giving death a crutch, Van Kuyck humanizes the ultimate end. He suggests that mortality isn't an omnipotent God, it's a tired old man doing a job that never ends. The walking stick is a symbol of physical failure and the degrading passage of time. It tells us that even the universe's most permanent structures are eventually subject to fatigue. This choice connects Van Kuyck to a much broader European tradition. Decades later, the filmmaker Fritz Lang would explore this same weary death in his films, depicting an entity that finds no joy in his work and wishes he could stop. But Van Kuyck got there first, using the visual language of the crutch to bridge the gap between the supernatural and the disabled. In art history, the crutch has often been a symbol of bodily failure, from ancient Egyptian carvings to the surrealist obsessions of Salvador Dali. Dali once described the crutch as a support for the tenderness of soft structures, an anchor in reality for things that are failing. Here, the crutch supports the very thing that is supposed to be our final, rigid form. Even our bones, it seems, eventually need a hand to hold. We also have to consider the world Van Kuyck lived in. Today, we often hide death away in hospitals and hospice centers, but in the 1800s, death was a constant domestic presence. Child mortality rates were staggering. Almost every family had lost a sibling, a child, or a cousin to consumption or cholera. There was a massive culture of mourning, post-mortem photography, mourning jewelry made of human hair, and elaborate funeral rituals. For a 19th century viewer, this painting wouldn't have been a shocking horror movie jump scare. It would have been a deeply relatable, cathartic reflection of their daily lives. They knew that innocence offered no protection. They lived with the silent companion every single day. When we look at the sky in the background, we see this reality reflected in the atmosphere. The sun is setting, casting long, horizontal streaks of fire and gold across the horizon. In landscape painting, a sunset is the universal shorthand for the end of a life cycle. But notice the lighting. Because the sun is behind the figures, the front of the skeleton's skull is plunged into total shadow. We can't see his eyes. We only see a dark, hollow void beneath the hood. The girl, however, is catching the last of the light. She is glowing. This creates a powerful color contrast, the warm, living hues of the child against the cold, shadowy silhouette of the reaper. It's a visual representation of the boundary between our world and the next, a line as thin and as beautiful as a sunset. Van Kuyck's genius lies in his restraint. He could have painted a scene of terror, but he chose to paint a scene of company. He shows us that death isn't something that happens to us at the very end. It is something that walks with us from the very beginning. It is our internal architecture, our biological destiny, moving at our exact pace, waiting for the light to finally fade. The painting doesn't ask us to be afraid. Instead, it asks us to notice the girl. It asks us to look at those yellow flowers and realize how precious they are precisely because they won't last. The beauty of the flowers is inseparable from the fact that they are dying. The joy of the girl's walk is inseparable from the fact that the path has an end. In the end, Frans van Kuyck's Death and the Girl is a masterpiece of empathy. It takes the most terrifying concept in human existence and turns it into a weary, quiet walk through a field. It reminds us that while we cannot outrun the figure on the crutches, we can choose to focus on the flowers while we have them. It's a somber, poetic acceptance of the way the world works. As the sun dips below the horizon in the painting, we are left with a lingering sense of peace. The girl is still walking, the flowers are still bright, and for now, that is enough.